Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's session, Europe Under Attack. We're joined by an esteemed panel of experts and policymakers. Mr. Michael Chertoff is the former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security of the United States and the executive chairman and co-founder of the Chertoff Group. Mr. August Hanning, Dr. August Hanning, was the former president of the German Federal Intelligence Agency in Berlin. To his left is General Ephraim Lapid, lecturer at Bar Ilan University and a former senior intelligence officer in the Israeli Defense Forces. And finally, Mr. John Frank is the vice president of EU government affairs for Microsoft, based in Brussels. Now, I'm very eager to hear what our panel has to say today on this topic. But before we do, I just want to first remind ourselves why this session is called Europe Under Attack. Should have gotten your hearts racing and your minds focused on this issue. As the ISIS attacks in Paris and Brussels have put a spotlight on European intelligence and Europe's domestic security architecture, and as always happens in the wake of terrorist assaults, officials and journalists and investigators have pointed to a series of lapses and errors, shortcomings that probably made the attacks more likely to succeed. Missed signals, failures to coordinate, a lack of attention to the threat, basic bureaucratic dysfunction, maybe even a misunderstanding of the threat. Of course, now the responsibility for terrorist attacks always lies with the extremists who use this brutal form of violence to sow fear and chaos. But whenever they succeed, I think it's reasonable to ask what more authorities could have done to prevent such strikes, and whether there are systemic problems that can be addressed by reforms, new approaches, or even new technologies. I think our esteemed panel of experts is very well positioned to shed some light on that question. I'd like to start by just asking each of you for your estimate of the current threat in Europe in the wake of the Paris and Brussels attacks. Now that the people who carried out those assaults have either perished or been identified, in some cases been apprehended, is it your sense that Europe is now safer? Is the threat level about the same as before those, or is it even higher than prior to the attacks? Let's start with you, Secretary Chertoff.
I'm not sure I'm convinced that everybody in the network has been apprehended. And I would be reluctant to say that the threat is diminished. Even if most of this network has been disrupted, I have no reason to believe that the pool of recruits or the existence of other networks has been disrupted. And so therefore, I think you have to assume that the kinds of attacks which we saw in the last 6 months, and actually previous to that, are going to continue, particularly as Daesh feels itself under pressure in terms of its territory in Iraq and Syria, and there will be a natural tendency to want to shift the emphasis by making people in Europe and in the United States, if they can get there, pay a price.
Yes, I think the threat level is high. We in Germany, we have been lucky, more or less, until now. But the German authorities are getting day by day hints of the preparation of terrorist attacks in Germany. And therefore, yes, we are high alerted in Germany. And my personal opinion is, yes, we will face more terrorist attacks in Europe.
General Lapid, your thoughts?
We saw the film, and I think that the film make us to be a little bit in panic, but I recommend to be much more under control. The experience that I share with you from Israel is 24/7 permanent, not only terror, but a vision of being alert and being in early warning situation, and we can overcome. I recommend Europe to share with us this vision.
I think we'll return to that theme. Mr. Frank.
My colleagues on the panel today are all intelligence experts. I'm more in technology and public policy, so that I can answer the question as a resident of Brussels, which is the terror threat remains, for those of us who are residents, too high and higher than it needs to be.
Secretary Chertoff, the sort of framework for this discussion is the idea of reform. And of course, after 9/11, the U.S. overhauled its domestic security architecture, created the Department of Homeland Security, which you headed, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. There was criticism in the years after that rather than simplifying and strengthening the system, that those reforms basically created another level of bureaucracy. That was kind of a common refrain. What do you think? Was the overhaul in the U.S. successful? And if so, why? And the second part of that question would be, what can Europeans learn from that experience in terms of what to do and what not to do?
So the proof of the pudding is, if you look at the period of time after 9/11, there have been remarkably few successful attacks on American soil. During my tenure, we had none. In 2009, I think it was, or 2010, we had the Boston Marathon bombing, we had Nidal Hassan, and of course we had San Bernardino. But if you look at that over a period of 15 years, you'd have to describe it by any realistic measure as success. And I think a lot of that is due to the unification of effort that occurred in the wake of September 11th. Not to say that creating a new institution is painless, and there's always a certain amount of waste and bureaucratic effort that has to go into it. But at the end of the day, we did manage to create a system which fused and integrated intelligence from multiple sources, not only multiple federal agencies, but state and locals, and was able to turn that into operational disruption very quickly. And so that after some initial bumps in the road, I think we actually became quite efficient. I think the lesson for Europe is this, Schengen opens up the borders and allows for the free flow of people within Europe. We ought to have a Schengen for intelligence, where you can have a free flow of intelligence in Europe. And that means several different things. First, you have to improve your collection capabilities. Second, you have to standardize and integrate them so that they can be accessible to, even within a single nation state, to all the relevant actors. And finally, you need to find a way to share that information among different countries so the terrorists can't hide out by simply moving from one country to another with the information being left behind them. And I don't want to minimize the importance of that task and the difficulty of that task, but without that, you're going to have more of what we've seen currently.
Do you think there might be any trade-off to centralization? Were there trade-offs in the DHS experience, things that bumps in the road you mentioned that European policymakers looking at this should really watch out for?
Well, I don't think we need to centralize in the sense of have a single large institution that manages everything. Happily, we live in a world now where a lot of working is done through the network. And technology as well as processes can be adapted to a network model where you can share information. You can have a common set of rule sets and standards about how you do that, but you don't have to have one big boss running all of that. And frankly, given the fact that there are differences in capability and differences in some of the legal rules, it may be that not every country will get access to the same type of information, but at least you can create a kind of a core group and a benchmark, and then invite people as they raise their game to become members of that core.
That's interesting. You're talking sort of about procedural and technological standardization rather than bureaucratic centralization.
Exactly.
Dr. Henning, You made some statements calling attention to what you perceive to be the high risk posed by migrants entering Europe from the Middle East and elsewhere. Last fall, you called for Germany to close its borders to immigrants without an entry permit. Throughout this conference, however, we've heard from many people, including Secretary Madeleine Albright yesterday, who say that warnings of that kind are a form of exaggerating the threat posed by the migrants, and that by singling out refugees and migrants as potential risks, European governments might actually validate the jihadist narrative that, you know, the West is at war with Islam. Why is Secretary Albright or others who make that argument, why are they wrong?
I think we have to improve our security measures in Europe, and Michael has stated it. There is a lot to be done. We have done a lot after 9/11. We have, for example, in Germany, organized the counterterrorism center. We have improved the cooperation inside Germany, but with our colleagues in Europe as well. We have still some weaknesses. I think we need more common data shares, files. I think that's one of the points. And Michael has proposed that we should establish a system like the Schengen system. We will have the counterterrorism center. I think that is one of the very important points, to have this common data files. But it would be useless if you don't have the necessary data. And to gain the necessary data, therefore, the control of the borders is very important. We have had a weak border control, you know, in Greece. We have seen the refugee crisis. And I think, yes, we have to go back to a very strict border control. I think that is a real weakness. And we have seen the situation in Brussels and Paris, and if you analyze the activists who have carried out these terrorist attacks, there have been three groups. One group who lived in Paris and Brussels. The other group have been recruited from foreign fighters, having been in Syria and Iraq. And the third group, they have used these refugee lines through Europe, and they have been recruited in Germany. Or they came to Germany via these weak border controls and the so-called Balkan route. Therefore, again, you need data, you need a better control. That's one tool, but it's a very important one. And therefore, I think, yes, we have to do more in this field and a better data share, and other points we can touch later on.
Sure. You mentioned the three groups, and the first group you mentioned was people who are actually radicalized extremists who are already in Europe. In other words, some of them may be European citizens. As a kind of counterfactual to what you're saying, let's say that there was really tight border control, and then you saw another attack launched by people who borders control did very little to prevent because they are Europeans. What would be your defense of the policy in the face of an attack like that?
Of course, a better database. I think that's a very important point. But you need, of course, the necessary personal resources. You need the technical resources. We need a better surveillance. We need a better techniques for communication, interception, and communication surveillance. I think these all are weaknesses. And we have legal problems, especially in Germany and in other states as well. I think we have to think over, we have to find a new balance between threats and our legal framework.
All right. General Pete, you actually in your introductory remarks touched on a theme that I want to ask you about. You know, for the past 2 decades, Israelis have essentially adapted to an almost constant threat of terrorism. You know, you looked at the video and some of our news coverage, which seems sort of panicky or even hysterical sometimes compared to a situation where every single day, if you live in an Israeli city, you have to wonder whether today is the day that there's going to be an attack, a bomb, maybe something as simple as a knife attack. You know, the threat's always there, and sometimes, unfortunately, extremists succeed in killing Israelis. And yet, even with the huge populations of Muslims living inside Israel and in territories that Israel occupies, terrorism has not actually proven to be an existential threat. And in a sense, Israelis, it seems to me, have developed a kind of resilience, a cultural and social resilience to terrorism. I wonder if you can sort of elaborate on that and on what you were indicating in your initial remarks about whether it might be less about approaches technologies or techniques that when Europe looks at Israel, what it might look at are social and cultural factors and how to prepare a population for an ongoing threat?
We repeated and repeated these 3 days the term European, but we have to remember that we speak about global terrorism. And speaking about global terrorism means that cooperation between countries, between intelligence services, intelligence and operation is vital, is much more vital than it was in the time of the Cold War. The terrorism, which is a virtual term, is based on people, individuals. We have to monitor the tens, the dozens of potential terrorists in a certain case out of millions, sometimes tens of millions of people. And we have to be permanently with the dilemma of freedom, the different freedoms that we have to keep, and on the other side to secure the global population, the domestic population, and we do it. I think that especially in this forum, in this conference, some people were not so satisfied with the cooperation between the countries, cooperation between organizations, cooperation between the EU states and NATO members. I think that we have, after all, to encourage more and more, especially now, the cooperation, because it's impossible, totally impossible, to think that one country can control the options, the threats. The threats are different. The threats are now a group of 3-4 people in Brussels, in Paris, or in Madrid, and only if we check the possibilities and evaluate it, we can do it better. What we can share with our experience is first the professional level of the different organizations in the establishment, but not only in the establishment, because what we see now, we did not yet mention the term cyber, but what cyber means that the whole population, the whole sectors are subject to be offended. And we have to take all of them in a certain effort of defending and sometimes also offensive capabilities. You mentioned very, very importantly the value of resilience of the society. We pay a very high attention to this mission. We have in Israel something that doesn't occur in any other country, I think. We have an annual exercise in Israel that we check ourselves from kids in the kindergarten until the prime minister. We check a weekly exercise, and we study lessons from year to year in order to improve ourselves. And that's, of course, typical to a country which is totally subject to these threats, but not exactly the same. But in other means, I'm sure that such a measure can be adapted also to other countries, to other organizations. The lesson is to check, to train, to see the cooperation between sectors and between countries.
Thank you. You mentioned cyber, and that's actually a good segue perhaps to John. You bring an interesting perspective to all this. You work at Microsoft, and you deal with some issues of privacy, government cooperation, private sector, public sector cooperation. There's been, I think it's safe to say, a backlash in recent years over the issue of government surveillance, particularly after the Snowden revelations, especially in Europe, but also in the US. At the same time, there have been these innovations in encryption that made it possible for ordinary people to enjoy a level of privacy in their electronic communications that they never have before. it strikes me as a bit of an arms race between private sector and government, but at the same time, there's a great deal of cooperation. In the wake of the attacks in Europe, in Paris and Brussels, what was the conversation at Microsoft in those ensuing weeks? And how does a company like yours see its role in protecting itself, also protecting its customers' data, and then also aiding governments in their legitimate efforts to prevent attacks like this?
The privacy of our customers is essential to being able to conduct day-to-day business and day-to-day just normal lives. And so encryption and privacy technologies are, they are essential. We tend to focus on this one aspect of government access, but generally it's, people don't want their credit cards stolen, they don't want their email accounts hacked. It's the broad range of essentially privacy and security that for day-to-day consumers, it's not really concerned about the government. Although, generally people want to know that their privacy is respected. And we have been very focused on working with industry partners on trying to develop a legal framework that works for security and privacy, and works across borders, because one of the Snowden effects was that people in Germany and people in Brazil were far less interested in the trade-off of giving up their privacy to make the U.S. more secure than U.S. citizens who felt it was a reasonable compromise. And so we need a system that works across the European Union, but also internationally, broadly. And we also need a dialogue that brings in the privacy experts and the security people to talk about real-life scenarios. As a private company, we talk to the national data protection authorities and the privacy civil society a lot, and we also talk to government, security, and law enforcement. But it's not so clear they're talking to each other about scenarios that intersect. And so whether it's the fingerprints of refugees, and whether they can be put through databases to screen for criminal and terrorists, or other scenarios, I think part of it's getting the groups of people to recognize that in Europe, privacy is a fundamental right, security is a fundamental right, but neither one's an absolute right. Mm-hmm. And you need to kind of work it through. It's a democratic process. As a technology company, we can see where the intersections occur. We don't pretend to know how to calibrate the answer exactly.
In the aftermath of the Snowden revelations, one of the questions was there going to be a breakdown in trust between Silicon Valley tech companies and the government? There was a lot of debate about this, and I think the same thing has happened in Europe. Since then, has that improved? Do you feel a greater level of mutual trust? Has it deteriorated further? Is it still a tense situation between tech companies and governments?
I think we're still in counseling. No, it's a different relationship, in part because we found out things from the Snowden disclosures that we didn't know, and
right.
and the fact that we took steps to ensure that all of the communications between our data centers is now heavily encrypted, and whenever data flows across any of our networks, it's heavily encrypted. And one of my colleagues came out and announced that we view governments as advanced persistent threats. It's not just the U.S. government, but just generally state-sponsored actors can put the resources and can be very sophisticated, and that we have to view them as highly capable people who have an interest in getting data of our customers.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask a question of both Secretary Chertoff and Dr. Hannig. Let's say hypothetically the EU were to set up some kind of central, I was going to say central intelligence agency, that's probably not the right term to use, some kind of centralized counterterrorism or intelligence bureaucracy, more than what they already have. And let's say, hypothetically, you were put in charge of it, and it was your job to kind of come up with a strategic plan for what that organization should do. What are the first, most obvious kind of low-hanging fruit steps that governments would have to take, and that a bureaucracy like that would have to take to improve the situation?
Well, let me begin by saying I actually don't think that having a single large organization in Europe would be the right answer, but let's assume for the sake of argument you have that. I think you have to start, as August said, with collection, because if you don't have the data, then you can't analyze it and sort it and distribute it. And I think there's a lot of data out there which I think Europeans are now beginning to think more about collecting. PNR data is a good example. I think there was just a decision a few days ago to begin collecting PNR data. I can tell you.
Can you explain for everyone what PNR
Yeah,
data is?
PNR data is passenger name record data. If you get on an airplane and you fly to the United States now, it's basic stuff: your name, your address, your telephone number, your form of payment, things which are necessary in order to allow the airline to basically do business with you. It turns out that data is incredibly important if you can connect it up with other PNR data. And we actually went back and analyzed, when I was in office, we analyzed the hijackers from 9/11. And we discovered that had we then had PNR data analytic capability before 9/11, we would have connected 15 of the 19 hijackers to terrorist financiers or operatives in the Middle East. And those people never would have gotten on an airplane. So that's an example of the kind of data you have to begin to collect. There are multiple databases in Europe. Again, things like license plates, criminal records, things of that sort. You've got to be able to bring that together and search across those multiple platforms so that if you are thinking about, for example, a petty criminal who is beginning to look like they might become radicalized, you can now tap into all the different data sources that tell you about the person's background, where they might be, what they might be purchasing, where they might be traveling. I'm not suggesting you do this willy-nilly, but what it does do is it gives you a force multiplier with respect to tracking people who you have on a watch list, for example. And if you look back at what happened in Belgium and France, it appears now in retrospect that a number of people as to whom there was an alert were simply lost. And if you can connect up the databases just as a beginning and collect all that, then you can begin to fuse it and you can begin to take operational steps to prevent that kind of event ever happening again.
Maybe I'll ask you to follow up on that. What stands in the way of the kind of link-up that the Secretary is describing?
I think we are on the way. We have undertaken additional steps. The German government has made the decision during the last days that we are ready in Germany to share the data, to have common data files, data sharing, even with Israel. It's not so easy sometimes, but yes, there is a principal decision, and I think it needs to be done, and I can only underline what Michael has stated here. On the other side, your question, central bodies. I think national security principally is a responsibility of the member states, is not a responsibility of the EU. Nevertheless, we have now a lot of bodies in Europe where we have a platform where we can exchange data, exchange experiences, and it's a platform for cooperation. Europol, for example, is a wonderful platform for cooperation in the police field. We have the CITSEN in Brussels. I think we have already a very good cooperation on behalf of strategic intelligence. Yes, it works. If it will be operational, it's difficult between intelligence organizations because they like to operate bilaterally. That's the normal business because you need trust. Sometimes trust is a very high value and not so easy. But nevertheless, I think we have achieved a lot already. I think centralization alone does not really solve the problems. Looking to Brussels, there have been a lot of knowledge, there have been a lot of information to Belgian police forces, but it's very difficult for them to follow and to undertake the necessary measures. That leads me to the point, we have some weaknesses in Europe. We have weaknesses in Germany, there have been weaknesses in Belgium and France, and I think we should try to encourage the states to tackle their weaknesses. Maybe that we can provide more financial resources or give them advice. I think that could be a European, a common responsibility. Again, principally it is the responsibility of the member states, but the European level could be helpful in order to analyze the situation and to encourage the member states to enhance their capabilities.
I'm going to stay on you for just 1 second because I want to follow up on that question before we go on to a couple of different questions. In the aftermath of the attacks, both in Paris and in Brussels, the Belgian authorities in particular were subject to really harsh criticism that, the Belgian system is fragmented, the language differences are there, there's a multitude of different agencies, and that organizationally it's kind of a mess, that in some sense it's a governance problem and almost a policing problem more than even a policy problem. But if the terrorists had come out of Berlin or somewhere in London, which I think we can all agree is almost just as likely, would we be having that conversation? What I'm trying to get at, the question I'm trying to get at is, by focusing on these procedural issues, do we risk missing the point that we can make all kinds of fixes, but the threat, will stay there, and that, of course, the systems we now have, that we currently have, that we talk about as a problem, are the result of prior failures, right? I mean, the laws that we now have and the policies you now have became out of the result of saying, oh gosh, we missed this, what do we have to fix? How do you avoid that trap of essentially making policy based on your prior failure, but not considering what you're really likely to face in the future?
Maybe two answers. First of all, if a terrorist attack would be carried out everywhere in Europe, afterwards you will always have very heavy criticism towards the authorities. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of terrorist suspects in Europe. In Germany, I think we have nearly 1,000 who could carry out terrorist attacks. We see this in Belgium, we see this in France. Look to the foreign fighters who came back from Syria. You can't really overview all these people. It's completely not possible. Therefore, you have to set priorities. And afterwards, of course, this should have been done, this and that, and so on. You have always the problem after every terrorist attack that you have to criticize. But on the other side, we are learning. We are analyzing the situation, and we have seen it after 9/11. And I think Michael is a witness that we have learned our lessons. And again, if you know the needle, and afterwards the needle has been in the haystack, it's very easy to criticize. But if you see the haystack and you have to look for the needle, and I can assure you that's far more difficult. Therefore, again, we are all learning. The Belgians are learning afterwards. But nevertheless, we have to do more, and that's the question of capabilities. We have to do more on behalf of personal resources. We have to strengthen our security forces, our intelligence forces, and we have to strengthen our technical capabilities. I think that's the other point.
Let me add one thing which we were talking about yesterday, which is, unlike when we were dealing with Al-Qaeda, I think this iteration of radical jihadi terrorism is much more rooted in people in the community who are petty criminals, who start out life as criminals. I gather some of the terrorists in Belgium ran a whiskey bar, so they were hardly devout Muslims. At some point, the petty criminality turned into something that made them become radicalized. That suggests that people in the community, as well as local police, are going to become important sources of warning and intelligence that maybe wasn't true 15 years ago when we were more worried about a centralized Al-Qaeda. So I think that's part of, as we look ahead, part of what we need to be thinking about. How do we train them, and how do we create an avenue to pick up this kind of information? And then I also think, again, looking back at a number of plots we disrupted over the years, what's striking about people who become radicalized and put on bombs or pick up guns is that there's all of a sudden a life change. Shortly before they wind up becoming operational, all of a sudden they stop going to the same places they used to go. Their buying habits change. A lot of their behavior changes. Now, there may be legitimate reasons or innocent reasons why people change behavior, but it actually turns out to be a pretty good red flag. Mm-hmm. So again, there are technologies out there that allow you to say, if you're looking through the haystack, ooh, so-and-so, all of a sudden there's a dramatic change. And I know as we, for example, think about the issue of whether we should, clearing people to get on airplanes, and who should get heavier scrutiny and who should get lesser scrutiny, we're beginning to look at these kinds of data elements as useful in helping you separate high-risk and low-risk passengers.
I want to bring General Lapid into this because I think this is something that the Israelis deal with a lot. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that what my colleagues raised relate to the term of big data. And only to illustrate some numbers from the Israeli point of view, we collect every day, 8 million pieces of information, and we have to select out of them only 80 which are valuable. I'm not impressed from the number 8 million. I'm much more impressed from the 80, which means the quality. And the quality means that these are the pieces that have to hit the information to the target. This means also a very short march of the information from collection to the soldier, sometimes to the soldier, sometimes to the policeman, sometimes to the pilot, sometimes to the naval capability, in order to bring the information. Information is not the mission. The mission is to translate the information to operation. And we are in a permanent effort to shorten this march to terms of seconds, sometimes minutes, and even less, bearing in mind that in Israel, different from Europe, hopefully, and you are successful, and luckily, our variety of threats start from knife to nuclear. And to bring every day, every moment, the capabilities to effectiveness in this variety, it's a big challenge. And I must share also the contribution of our industry. We have in Israel some 300 startups. This time we had less in the past. I'm sure that we'll have more in the future, which also cope with the challenge how to bring intelligence to be effective. And the fact that in Israel, also different from other countries, we have the young generation very, very involved based on our compulsory service, which means that every young male and female have to serve, bring us a very good creativity, and on the other side, a very active rotation. So all these bring the big data to a challenge that is dealt permanently.
Okay, I'd like to open up to questions from the audience at this point. We're going to be brief, please. Ask a question, please. And before you do, please introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and really let's try to keep it to 20 seconds and ask just one question, please. Okay. Gentleman with the glasses here on the end of the aisle.
Ewan McCaskill. I'm a reporter in the Guardian newspaper. The idea of greater sharing of intelligence is fine in theory, but if you look at the reality of, one of the most powerful intelligence organizations in the world is Five Eyes, US, UK, New Zealand, Canada, and Australia. Now, the idea of GCHQ and NSA providing lots of data to other countries in Europe, Five Eyes don't spy on one another, but they do spy on France and Germany and other countries. So how much data are they going to share with those countries? And on the same point, Michael Chertoff spoke about this free flow of information, Schengen. But who would be in the core group that you speak about? Sure, you could imagine maybe France and Belgium. Would you give it to Malta? I mean, who is in this core group? Okay, France, Germany, not Malta. What about Belgium?
Well, I guess that's directed to me. I mean, I don't want to minimize the fact that there are differences in capability and frankly, differences in the degree of trust that exists among nations. The EU is a very large a very large entity. It has a lot of different countries with a lot of different capabilities. I don't think we can let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If there is a high degree of trust, as you point out, among the Five Eyes, I think there's a very good trust relationship at the intelligence level and the law enforcement level between the United States and, let's say, France and Germany. I would suggest that, you know, what one does is you build a kind of a central core of people, of countries, and then perhaps to varying degrees, others can participate and share, recognizing that you're not necessarily throwing open all of your data. It may be more of a pull method as opposed to a push method. In other words, when there's a particular thread that's being followed, you present that to people in the group, and then they are able to search their databases and see if there's a connection. So without oversimplifying it or suggesting that it's just as easy as throwing open all your databases, there are ways to sculpt the degree of the relationship so as to maximize the amount of sharing within the limitations that flow from the fact that there are different legal regimes and different levels of trust.
Before I move on, you were reporting on, and I believe with Edward Snowden during those disclosures. Is that right? Am I right about that? You were.
Yeah, I was one of the reporters in Hong Kong with Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, and Edward Snowden gave me 60,000 documents.
Let me ask you a quick question then. What did you make of Secretary Chertoff's question, and what do you think Edward Snowden would make of that? Very briefly.
Sorry, which aspect of the...
Well, of what the Secretary was just saying, in response to your question about sharing, what do you think Snowden would make of that answer?
I think Snowden's answer would be, one of the revelations was the extent to which the NSA and GCHQ spy on so-called allies. You'd assume that France and Germany are allies of the US and the UK, so it came as a surprise to many people to realise the extent to which they were, even up to, we know about Angela Merkel.
Okay.
You know, can I just intervene? I can't let that go without saying two things. First of all, as we've seen from the discussion here, the ability to collect intelligence, even in friendly countries, unfortunately, in friendly countries, you have some bad people. And some of the 9/11 hijackers were in Germany before they became hijackers. And as we've just seen in the last few months, it's understandable why a country like the US would have an interest in knowing if there are Europeans in the visa waiver program who might be coming to the US to do some harm. So the idea that somehow collection is off limits, even among friendly countries, is, I think, and doesn't recognize the reality now of what the threats are. And the last thing I would say is to hear criticism about collection from a man who's sitting comfortably in Putin's Russia strikes me as ironic, to say the least.
Dr. Hacking, you wanted to follow up.
Yeah, two remarks. First of all, yes, we have a very good cooperation in Germany with GCHQ, with NSA in the terrorist field. We don't get the information which they are gathering in Germany or France or elsewhere. But of course, on behalf of terrorism, again, the NSA is a very valuable partner, and without the NSA, we would have suffered in Germany several terrorist attacks. I have to strengthen this point. I think it's a very important one. Snowden is a very interesting discussion. We have an investigation committee in the German Bundestag. I was a witness, and again, just only one remark. I have wondered if you are looking to the information which we got through you, through other channels, that the NSA has spied mainly in Europe, not in Russia, not in China. It's, for me, still a very interesting issue. Why we don't get any information about Russia? And as far as I know, Russia and China have been prime targets from the NSA, but you know better than me. It's my assumption. That's a little bit interesting issue, but I think we shouldn't discuss it in detail. We have make another platform, I think. It would be my suggestion to discuss the Snowden case. Very interesting issue.
Next, yes, ma'am, here in the front row, in blue jacket here.
Thank you very much. I'm Ana Borcela. I'm the chair of the European Affairs Committee in Romanian Deputy Chamber. We just happened to analyze this week one opinion that we've been asked by the European Commission, and that was to do with financing the terrorism. And we were arguing that it seems that in the recent years, the terrorists at large seems to be mastering the internet. They seem to really get a very good understanding how to use the internet, not just to push for their message from the propaganda point of view, but for radicalization and for recruiting other people. And here's the question, something that we argue in our opinion. How can we prevent the internet to become a deadly weapon in the arms of the terrorist groups? And maybe you might think to incriminate, to have a legislation that will incriminate such crimes. Because here I heard the discussion many times, and I've been educated, maybe I should have the full disclosure, say that I've been educated in one of the most liberal universities on earth, Yale Law School. So for me, the privacy, it's important, but the right to live, it's more important than anything else. So how
Okay,
do you
thank you.
envision,
Yes, let's-
including from the Microsoft point of view, not just the internet, but the social media, how will you consider incriminating those type of...
Yes, let's have. I'd like to hear General Lapid answer that issue, and then. But John, I would like you to talk a little bit about what you see as the proper way to handle the dilemma that I think the lady was addressing. General. Yep.
The internet is now the battlefield. What was in the past the traditional battlefield with tanks, with engineering, with soldiers, now is the internet, and we have to face it and to take it as a reality. The social media is a vital mission to all intelligence services, and you can all imagine that it's very difficult to monitor all. Therefore, the cooperation between countries and to divide and to understand, and we have different languages and different code words and so on, it is a big challenge. You raised also a factor which is not only internet and is one of the very important factors of our campaign against terrorism, is the finance arena. The finance arena, I really see it as an arena, is once again a topic of cooperation. We cannot exclude one country to do it, because the terrorists, who are different people, different identities, they use sometimes the privacy of banking, the privacy of financial systems, and this is one of the missions that we see, that if we can hit the financial infrastructure of terrorists, we can succeed more in our fight against what we call counter-terrorism. And the last word about social media, we have to remember that the private mobile of a person is for us now the whole world of information about a person. We know it virtually, we know it theoretically. We don't pay attention to what does it mean in our daily life. So for the innocent people, it's okay. But we look always to see the suspected people with the weaknesses of using mobile as a vehicle for information. Remember it also in your private and professional life.
John, does it make you at all nervous when you hear technology being mostly sort of framed in this way of being a sort of a battlefield, rather than, you know, a means to do business, a means to conduct your personal life? Does that make you nervous?
Well, obviously, the internet's open to everyone, and of course, good and bad. And there's a Nigerian prince who owes some people money, who's been sending letters for quite a while now. It's not a new phenomenon. We have been developing, you know, technology to try to address some of the social concerns. For example, child pornography, and creating a technology we call photo DNA, which we've shared with the rest of the industry to help scan for child pornography in a way that's not privacy intrusive. And we in the industry, we are in discussions with the European Commission and other governments about, you know, how can we, you know, make sure that terrorist content is not propagated? How can we make sure that there's counter narrative as well being presented? And so we can do some of those things, but that's not going to address some of the root cause issues. And broadly, you know, technology can address issues, but the issues they're addressing are more general. And one of the topics of just, you know, the silos of intelligence, even within Belgium, a great deal of press discussion about the silos within the Belgian government. Julian Tett of the Financial Times wrote a great book last fall called The Silo Effect. Mm-hmm. And going across, you know, all sorts of organizations, as we get more specialized, you know, silos do appear. And technology can be part of the solution, recognizing it's kind of, you know, silos will happen, and trying to find ways to design technology so that people, for example, can share information while still maintaining control of it, and limiting it through digital rights and other things. You know, the capabilities do exist in other organizations, and what we've developed there broadly in the technology community can be applied to some of the silos in the intelligence community, I think. And the other great thing about technology, it does enable organizations to scale. One of the big issues in Brussels, you know, is, you know, the government reports there's 117 people who've returned from Syria trained by ISIS, and they can't track them if it each takes 10 to 20 police officers to track one person. They have to deploy technology and be smarter about new ways of doing things. And I think that, you know, finding those new ways is essential to finding the new paradigm for how we're going to reinvent the intelligence project.
All right, we're going to try something. Before we take some more questions, we're going to do something kind of fun. We're going to try to ask you to decide something for us. If you could open up your GlobSec apps on your devices, we're going to do a little voting here. Tap on the voting option in your app, and you're going to be able to weigh in on this question. The question is this, and we talked about this a little bit earlier. It's more like a proposition. The EU should set up a European intelligence agency. That's the proposition. The EU should set up a European intelligence agency. Now, you have 4 choices into how you can vote, and once we vote, it will be interesting to see what the results were. Number 1, choice 1 would be yes, Europe needs multinational intelligence agency to counter terrorism. Number 2 would be also yes, but only if the European Parliament oversees its conduct. Number 3 would be no, an agency like that would be impossible to oversee. And number 4 would also be no, for the reason that intelligence should be in the hands of national governments, which is, I think, a point that emerged earlier. So please vote now for one of these 4 options. How would you all vote on this one? How would you all vote, each of you?
Yes, I have expressed only my...
Yes, you have. I think you said number 4,
yeah.
Intelligence hands in the national governments.
Yeah,
Secretary
but-
Shah?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with 4,
Right.
with the caveat that I think you could have a European set of standards and interoperability requirements that would facilitate sharing, and you could have network sharing, but and maybe an ad hoc sharing, but not a kind of permanent organization.
Sure. General?
I can see a central organization only for training, for doctrine, for strategy, but not for operation. One, because the responsibility is in the hands of nations. Second, the number of functions to coordinate real time is impossible. Maybe it's a nice question for a poll, but it's not an operational vehicle to handle daily.
And briefly, John, how would you have voted on that as a citizen? Or a resident, I should say.
No,
for-
right.
Yeah.
I think it's, I don't quite see an answer that fits.
Okay.
So, but there are common issues around the European Union that require greater coordination.
Okay.
And I think that, the external borders of the European Union, cover a lot of countries, and we can't leave it to each of them to develop their own ways of developing those tools, for example, and the information sharing from that.
Fair enough. That would be option 5. We'll say. All right. We actually have the results of your votes. Let's take a look. Okay. Interesting. Fairly spread, although I would say, a good, just over a third voting one, yes, that Europe needs a multinational intelligence agency. Actually, second place was also yes. So, in fact, there's an overwhelming majority for yes in this group, and a minority for a no. Those who did vote no tended to echo Secretary Chertoff and Dr. Hanning's concerns about, I guess I would say, sovereignty. But that's interesting. It seems like the two of you maybe have your work cut out to persuade everyone that this would actually be a bad idea. Why don't we move on to another question? Yes, sir. This gentleman in the middle here. And remember, let's keep your question brief, and please ask a question immediately.
Okay, my name is Andrea Bogdanovsky, coming from Analytica think tank in Skopje, Macedonia. Among other things, we work on intelligence governance as well. My question would be related. We heard a lot about trust, but how do we move forward? How do we enhance trust? I mean, Mr. Christoph's point was that we can work with the current level of trust and to sort of and see to do a core group of countries. But how do we move forward? We're member states number, it's number 28. So it's not 3, it's not 4. How do we move forward and how do we enhance trust? Thank you very much.
Anyone in particular want to jump out of that one?
I guess I had raised the issue. So I would say, first of all, there should be a set of standards about how information is handled and a demonstration that a country that's going to participate in this group, core group, is capable and willing to obey those standards. And some of it's very basic, but it is how do you handle classified material, how do you restrict disposition, things of that sort. But then I think there's a lot of it is relationship building, and that's why I say I would begin with a pull method, where you have countries that are seeking to become part of this core. If they have a particular thread they're following, they put it in, they ask if anybody has anything on this, they get a response, and over time a sense of trust and relationship is built up that allows for greater sharing, and I think you take it incrementally.
I think there's already a lot of trust inside Europe. There are a lot of platforms, for example, the Burner Club for the domestic services. We have Europol, we have a lot of meetings. I think all the heads of the European intelligence services, they know each other, and there is already trust. Of course, it could be improved. Yes, I agree. But again, there are a lot of informal channels inside Europe, and I think they are working not so bad.
I think that trust is a value that you don't speak a lot about it. You do it, you achieve it. I agree that generally by personal contact, and my impression is that the reality is much more optimistic than the feature that sometimes is exposed by media.
Okay, can we get another question? And is there any of our young leaders, the GlobSec Young Leaders Forum, anyone from that group like to ask a question? No? All right, we'll move on that. Yes, ma'am, here towards the end in the green here.
Nilabdev from Gateway House in Mumbai. I think there seems to be the understanding that terrorism is a global question. So how would it be that transnational cooperation just within Europe would be able to address the global links that terrorists seem to have?
That's a good question.
Yes,
Yeah, actually, go ahead, Dr. Henning. Then we'll hear
I
Dr.
agree,
General
I agree
David.
very
Yes.
much. I agree very much, and I started saying that we have to speak about global terrorism, which means global cooperation and global exchange, not only of information, but also of doctrine, of systems, of tactics. And it's done. It's done. It's not dealt here, but it's done. Not all the world, not all the time, but I'm sure that the cases you raised I'm sure your experience from India. India has also a certain bitter experience with terrorism, and it's not alone. And even in these cases, in order to interrogate, to investigate, to study the lessons, they shared much more than their own services. So we have to keep the term and to keep the inspiration of knowing that global means global cooperation.
Let me ask you a sort of follow-up question to that might narrow this down. I want to ask you, gentlemen, for your who gets better cooperation outside of the United States and Europe? Who currently gets better cooperation outside the transatlantic alliance, the U.S. or Europe, and why? And what can each one do to improve the cooperation it gets from countries outside of that transatlantic group?
So I can't speak to the quality of what Europeans get from other than the U.S., but I do think that the questioner raised an important point, and it's important that we've been talking about Europe here because this is a European-focused conference, but I can tell you the United States has had terrific, close, trusted intelligence sharing relationships with a number of countries in other parts of the world. For example, in the Middle East, there are a number of services there that actually are very cooperative with the U.S. and have warned us about impending attacks and saved lives. And that's true in Asia, and it's true in other parts of the world as well. So no one should take my remarks as suggesting that trust is exclusively within Europe. In fact, in many ways, some of the best trust relationships are in other parts of the world.
Are you at all worried that that's trending in the wrong direction now? That you get a lot of sort of paranoia, maybe hysteria, and complaints about that in Washington now?
Actually, I don't. I think my general sense is that the countries that have built up trust with us are continuing to be very close collaborations. I think the U.S. government has identified that, has said that we have very good intelligence sharing relations with many countries outside of Europe. And one thing I would emphasize, I think Dr. Heine can support this. In my experience, even when there is a political disagreement, the operational services tend to work very well together because they understand that they have the ultimate responsibility to save lives, and that's a very focusing experience.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, sure. You want to
One additional,
yeah, go ahead.
I think terrorism is global, yes, but it can be regional as well. We have a right-wing terrorism, for example, in Germany. The jihadist terrorism in Europe, I think, is regional, to a certain extent global. Yes, it depends a little bit from the character of terrorism. The point is that there are sometimes political difficulties. Michael has mentioned it. There is no common definition about terrorism. For one state, terrorists are freedom fighters, for others, terrorists. And that is sometimes not so easy. I remember a lot of discussions with our Chinese colleagues. For them, everybody who is supporting the political issue of independence of some parts of China in the north, Urumqi and elsewhere, is a terrorist. And we have had a lot of discussions with Turkey about the Kurdish question, a lot of discussions. And if you have this kind of political issue, then it's very difficult sometimes to exchange operational information. But nevertheless, if we, in my time, but I think it's just the same now, if we get information about terrorist attacks, then we pass this information in spite of all the political difficulties. And in fact, our cooperation is very good with states in the Middle East and with Asia. There's a common understanding that we have a common responsibility to save lives, and that is, I think, a good ground, and that's feeding cooperation between the intelligence services.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am, here in the front row, in the red. Actually, I was pointing at you. Yeah, in the red.
Yes, my question is very simple.
Can you please tell us who you are?
Oh yeah, Koni Bakri from Indonesia. My question is how we are saying about global cooperations, while at the same time countries, region have a different interests. For example, me coming from Indonesia, 13% of the globe, you know, from a strategical point of view, we have to share part of the eastern part with the US, but the western part with the Chinese. So this open communications or intelligence information, of course, will be clashing between the Chinese interest and the US interest. So what does the global cooperation mean? Sometimes confusing me. Anyone can answer that? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, General, why don't you take a stab at that? Because I think that Israel is sort of positioned in a way between a lot of these places, and you might have a good perspective on that.
It's a good question, because when we say global, it doesn't mean literally every state with every other state, with all the world. Global means that we have to see sometimes common topics are with Europe, some other topics are common with Latin America, some are with Australia and others. The case of Indonesia is wonderful from my point of view, because Israel may be different from other countries, has also some hidden relations with some countries that formally and publicly are not known. And we are looking forward, of course.
Well, now they are.
I hope that your leaders are brave enough, like you, to say it publicly. But Indonesia is not alone. We have a set of countries that unfortunately, really unfortunately from our point of view, are not able or not ready or not whatever not to be in formal relations with Israel. And we find also the ways to these parts of the global world.
That's fascinating. Yes, the gentleman in the back with his hand raised, the white shirt.
Hi there. So my question to the panel is...
Can you tell us who you are, please?
Naturally. My name is Andrew Redman. I'm a journalist with EU Observer in Brussels.
And your question?
So my question is Israeli intelligence and security operations, is that a good model? On the one hand, we've heard how agile it is, seconds from operational intelligence to the Israeli Air Force pilot presumably discharging his weapon. But on the other hand, it's highly aggressive, and there's more violence in Israel than in any of the other two countries represented up there right now. So
all right, let's start actually with General Lapid responding to that, and then I want to hear from the Secretary and Dr. Hennig about that question. Go ahead. General.
I would better be New Zealand. I'm sure that New Zealand has very, very few, if at all, opponents or enemies. Our situation, even in this forum, in this conference, our situation is totally different from all. We are ready to bridge most, not all, because it's impossible, but most of the gaps between our neighbors. We need one word which is missed in the vocabulary, which is compromise. And every one of us know that compromise is a vital word in our private life, with our partner, with our neighbors, with our company, and so on. This term is missed in the political debate in the Middle East. You can see it also not only from Israeli point of view, you can see it also from Syrian point of view, from Iraqi point of view, from Yemen point of view, from Libyan point of view, different points of view. So Israel has to be strong in order to secure its independence. It's I know a phrase which is on one hand it's like literature, but for us it's reality, and we have to implement it daily. And after all, I invite all of you to see that the reality in Israel is not only terrorism, not only police, not only counterterrorism. You can see wonderful beaches, wonderful places for entertainment, and nice weather, nice climate. And the Mediterranean is also in the eastern part, not only in the central and western part.
Okay, let me ask you, gentlemen, to reflect on that for a second. Putting aside the difference in the political situation, which is obvious and which structures some of this, do either of you look as policymakers at Israel and say, "Oh, I wish we did X, Y, or Z"?
Well, I think there's some, great lessons, and the Israelis are very, very skilled at doing counterterrorism intelligence. One of the things to remember, though, is there's a big difference in scale. I used to get asked, with respect to aviation, there's a much more intensive system in the Israeli airport in terms of how they interview people and things of that sort. But remember, in the United States, we've got literally tens of millions more people a day who are transiting the airports. So there's a challenge in scaling what you might do in a relatively small population in a very large population. So not everything fits depending on the size of your pool, but it's certainly always useful to look to other countries for important lessons about how to proceed.
Dr. Haney?
Yes, I was regularly in Israel, and we have learned, of course, from the experiences in Israel, but we have to bear in mind Israel is in a special situation. There is a completely different legal framework, understandable. We in Germany, the foreign intelligence services, are strictly limited, collecting information, no other actions. And looking to Israel, I know this is a very different framework. I just want to tell this. Therefore, again, yes, in Israel, they have a very good system in identifying terrorists and to cooperate between each other. The military service, foreign service, the internal service, I think they have a very good system there, a very good counterterrorism center. And to a certain extent, yes, we have learned a lot from Israel. But again, Israel is in a special situation, and we can't copy this.
Before we move on, John, you had something that General Pede mentioned before, sort of, I wondered whether you might respond to it. He talked about the entrepreneurialism in Israel, these 300 startups, and there's a lot of kind of cooperation between government and private sector there. Is there any kind of model, putting aside Israeli security, are there other models maybe from public-private cooperation that Israel offers?
Well, I think deploying technology on hard problems, it's not a purely technical matter. It requires an engagement and understanding the issue, whether it's an intelligence problem or a medical problem or any problem. But I think that sometimes a response to a crisis or something is to think about legislation or regulation, but what we really need is an operational response, and we need to think about, how do we get there? And sometimes people don't give enough consideration to what technology can do and how technology, well developed in another area, can be very quickly and easily sort of transplanted and transposed and deployed to get you very quickly up the ladder. I mean, I think the people in Belgium right now are not very patient. They're not, they don't want to wait how many more years for the regional differences to build trust across the divide on intelligence. They want solutions now. And I think that there's a political imperative, and there's also technology, whether it's ours, anybody else's, or startups, can be a part of getting to an operational solution faster.
Questions? Yes, the gentleman here in the blue shirt. Please let us know who you are and ask a brief question, please.
My name is Jakub Godzimilski, and very brief from the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. And my question is about linking the issue of intelligence and terrorism to another topic that is also very high on the agenda currently, the issue of hybrid warfare. we know from recent history that there have been countries that sponsored terrorism during the Cold War. After the Cold War ended, we learned that, for instance, countries like Eastern Germany, Hungary, Soviet Union,
Okay,
Poland.
let's get to the question, please.
And we have also seen some instances of this hybrid warfare being launched against countries like Ukraine with people serving in one country's special services like Igor Girkin, known also
Okay,
as,
sir, I'm going to have to ask you to
Ukraine.
please ask a question.
How you can trust when cooperating with countries like Russia that what they are doing is really what we expect them to do in this situation, with hybrid warfare being one of the instruments that they have been using in order to undermine our system and systems of other countries.
Okay, I think well, I'm going to try to translate that question because I think there is one there, which is that are we doing ourselves a disservice by looking at terrorism as a sort of discrete phenomenon, separate from a larger issue of what the gentleman referred to as hybrid warfare or asymmetric warfare? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I guess I would say that, I mean, obviously, hybrid warfare, the intelligence collection issues there tend to be focused by definition on nation states. Terrorism, at least the ISIS terrorism, Daesh terrorism, is not nation state driven. Now Hezbollah is nation state driven. So, I mean, you're going to have different contexts with respect to intelligence. I think generally, though, the techniques you're going to want to use are going to be in many respects similar, although with nation states you tend to focus on collecting intelligence about leaders. One other thing I would say is this: increasingly, the kind of intelligence we use for terrorist networks is very similar to what we do with transnational crime. And if you look at what's going on in some of the countries in Central America where you have large, powerful transnational criminal groups that are really challenging the governance of those countries and who are carrying out atrocities that look as if they're modeled on what we're seeing in parts of the Middle East, including beheadings, those are also a threat to order. And some of the intelligence techniques and analyses that we are talking about here are applicable as well to transnational organized crime.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Yes, the young woman in the white shirt over there.
Thank you. Irina Rizmal, Center for Euro-Atlantic Studies from Belgrade, Serbia. I have two short questions.
Please just keep it to one question.
Okay.
Thank you.
If we talked about the need for greater and better data collection, how do you see the new EU regulation on data privacy from the other day affecting this?
I'd actually like John to take a first crack at that, please.
I think the data protection regulation, it's a very important step, as is the Privacy Shield, the Transatlantic Agreement. But I think there's more work to be done at actually trying to figure out how the intelligence rules or intelligence policies and privacy get mapped out in specific scenarios. Because
could you give us an example?
Well, so an example I mentioned briefly before. So when refugees come across the border, they can be fingerprinted for identification purposes, but they're not permitted to run those fingerprints through databases to check for terrorism or criminal behavior. And it's sort of like, I'm sure there's a rational reason for it, but I think if people thought about the broader context, they might say, well, that's maybe not the right policy that we need to work out. And I think by and large, the European Court has said that intelligence gathering needs to be proportionate and necessary, and there's some principles there. We're beginning this debate at the sort of high-level principles, and yet there needs to be a discussion at the very detailed operational level to actually figure some of these things out. And I think that's, and my concern is I don't see a forum where that's going to take place.
General.
I think that this question relates to the quality of democracy generally. And I'm sure that every country has different culture of democracy, and defending the freedoms is not only related with the techniques and with SIGINT and with cyber. It relates to all the climate of defending the freedoms of people. So I recommend not to be so suspected about the technology. We have to be much more aware to the spirit of democracy that leadership in different countries send to its population.
Any more questions? Yes, the gentleman here. Please, we are coming down to the end of our session, so keep it brief.
Right, Frank O'Donnell, the Irish Institute of International and European Affairs.
Can you stand, please?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
I'd like to hear from the members of the panel on cooperation with the public, not just in terms of monitoring our mobile phones, but maybe using our mobile phones to convey information that we might suspect something is happening in our neighborhood. Are there hotlines, specific anti-terrorist hotlines in every country, for example? I was recently on an Irish beach, not as sunny as an Israeli one, and there was a man waving a gun around. I called the police. It took them about 20 minutes to arrive. The poor old man on it. He was a homeless person with an air gun, but he was menacing in his activity.
So the question is how to improve public cooperation writ large with anti-terrorism. And I would add a little codicil to that, which is to say, how do you deal with that challenge? This gentleman was on the beach and someone was waving a gun around, but let's say I'm a young Muslim living in an immigrant community in Paris or London, and I'm hearing a lot of talk about policing and about cooperation. How do you win the trust of someone like that? Because of course he or she is going to be able to offer a lot more assistance, possibly, but they won't if they feel as though they're not going to be taken seriously or that they're going to be discriminated against. Can you please talk about that as well? Let's start with you.
You go first.
Okay, I think, yes, I think there is a certain trust in the German population at least. I think we have seen in Belgium that very valuable information was provided by a taxi driver, for example.
Right.
I think it has worked. Just the same in Germany. We have got a lot of hints from the German population on behalf of people who have changed their behavior, who have been in social networks. Social networks play a very important role, and we get day by day a lot of hints from the population. I think yes, it works at least in Germany and in Belgium as well.
I would say that there's some technical things you can do to make it easier for people to report. I think, though, the really interesting part of the question is how do you deal with gaining trust in the community in terms of people countering violent radicalization and also their willingness to go to the authorities when they see somebody who's beginning to become dangerous. And this is very challenging because right now, and we were talking about this earlier, the model, it's a very binary situation. Either we're doing nothing or we're doing something in the law enforcement thing. And it's kind of hard to say to a parent, turn your kid in to be arrested, or to a friend, turn your friend in to be arrested. The question is whether we ought to have a model where there's a way of intervening at an early stage that's not necessarily the criminal justice, but involves some kind of social work that maybe guides a person back. And I think that's something where I think, frankly, the U.S. can learn from some other countries. There's some countries in the Middle East and in Asia that have very good systems for kind of deprogramming people when they're getting radicalized. And if there were a way to set that up without necessarily having to put someone in jail, I think you actually would be able to earn more trust.
Yeah. One short additional remark is prevention. I think prevention is a very important point. Mm-hmm. And we have in Germany and other states as well, hotlines for parents, for example, who see that their children are endangered to go to Syria as foreign fighters as well. And it works. We have I think it's, they're practicing, and I had contacts some months ago, and I was told, yes, we have really been successful, and we have prevented young people from going to Syria, from being foreign fighters. I think that's a very important point on behalf of prevention of terrorism. I can only add what you have said.
Just very briefly, John.
A quick word in the online context. You know, essentially from discussions with the European Commission, with Facebook and Google and us, we are deploying crowdsourcing. So, encouraging people to, if they see terrorist content, report it quickly. So if we can get, rather than trying to centralize monitoring, crowdsourcing it, which is essentially engaging people to participate.
All right, now just before we thank our panel for this excellent and sort of sobering discussion. I want to ask the moderator, actually, of our next and our final session, that's Nick Gowing, to